For the most part, professional boxing is meant to be a pretty decisive sport where all of the action takes place in the ring, and the better man walks out of that ring as a victor. It's quite difficult for there to be any uncertainty when it comes to someone getting knocked out, but regardless, the sport has seen its fair share of controversy, politics invading competition, scandalous decisions, and of course biting, all of that and more in today's video. Muhammad Ali and Vietnam. It's a bit of an understatement to say that the Vietnam War was not received favorable by American citizens, especially when the US government instituted the draft in an attempt to fill the military's ranks with those who were given no choice in the matter. Though most found themselves forced to take the call and battle an enemy that they had no quarrel with. Some men outright refused to be deployed to Vietnam, facing public scrutiny and even legal action. Muhammad Ali was one of these men. By the outbreak of the war in 1967, Ali was riding high, having established himself as one of the greatest of all time, the reigning and defending heavyweight champion of the world in the prime of his career. And then the call for war came. Ali was not willing to fight a war that he didn't believe in on the behalf of a country that did not believe in him. And so he was arrested for draft dodging, being sentenced to 5 years in prison and receiving a $10,000 fine. He managed to avoid prison time after appealing the sentence, but the real kicker was that he was banned from boxing for 3 years by the New York State Boxing Commission, the de facto leaders of the sport. In 1970, he finally made his return and later went on to reclaim his championship. But the fact remains that Ali was robbed of 3 years of his career due to the controversy of taking a stand against war. Jake LaMotta takes a dive. With all the competition, there's a sacred principle that everyone is trying to win, that the joy of the entire thing is in proving that you're the best. Everything else comes secondary. The money, fame, all of it is a bonus on top of the spirit of competition. In a sport like boxing, this spirit is especially present. Two men enter and beat the living hell out of each other. It's a successor to the days of the gladiators and their duels, a test of skill, endurance, and overall toughness. That's why then, whenever someone isn't quite putting in 110% effort, it always leads to controversy and scandal. It's the late 1940s, and Jake LaMotta is a rising star in the sport, fighting a bout against the unfavored Billy Fox. And starting strong, his first couple jabs seemed to rock Fox. He could probably win this fight within the first round, but then he lets up. He gives Fox time to recover, passing up the opportunity to go in for the kill. By the fourth round, LaMotta's defensive abilities seem to have vanished. Fox lands shots with hilarious ease and eventually defeats the favorite by TKO. If that explanation makes it sound like LaMotta didn't want to win, it's because he didn't. It became apparent to everyone witnessing the fight that it was a fix, a very poorly executed one at that. With how obvious it was, LaMotta had taken a $20,000 payment from the mafia, though he'd lived to regret it as he was suspended from the sport and later investigated by the FBI because of the controversy. Wilder wants a body. Boxing is a dangerous sport, and although the competitors are trained to be tough and there are precautions in place to ensure safety, sometimes things do take a tragic turn for the worst. There have been multiple deaths caused by boxing, whether it's someone dying in the ring or dying later due to injuries sustained in the ring. It's an unfortunate hazard of the profession, a risk that you accept upon stepping into the squared circle. Most boxers involved in these unintentional deaths feel incredibly guilty, which you'd have to say is normal. They may be fighters, but nobody wants their opponent to die, right? Well, Deontay Wilder disagrees. Speaking in 2018, the American boxer shocked many when he admitted to wanting a body on his record, meaning that he wants to kill someone in the ring. This was already a volatile statement, but was made all the more controversial due to its timing, as just a month earlier, English boxer Scott Westgarth had passed away due to boxing-related injuries. Many came out to criticize Wilder's comments, though the power puncher did not seem to mind as he stuck to his comments, reiterating that he had no regrets in saying them as recently as 2020. Each case we've discussed so far are obviously noteworthy in their own, but it's about time we got into probably the most recognizable incident on this list, one that to an extent has defined an entire career. It's time to look at Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, and the carnivorous assault that took place during their match in 1997. Tyson bites Holyfield's ear. Mike Tyson's career has always been turbulent, a host of personal issues plaguing what was nonetheless a stunningly good career. In 1986, he became the youngest ever heavyweight champion at the age of just 19, and from then he established a record that has him comfortably included in any conversation on the topic of boxing's greatest of all time. 10 years after his record-breaking championship win, however, Tyson fell in a shocking upset against Evander Holyfield, losing the WBA championship via TKO. The stage was set for their rematch, and if anything, the new champion champion was even stronger than before, utterly dominating Tyson throughout the opening 2 rounds and even drawing blood. Slowly losing his composure throughout the fight, the 3rd round proved the breaking point for Tyson as he took off his mouth guard and spit off a piece of Holyfield's ear, spitting it onto the canvas. Hilariously, the fight actually continued for a short while after that, but eventually Tyson was disqualified. Somehow he was so shocked by this that he went on a rampage that prompted security to hit the ring to protect Holyfield. Unsurprisingly, Tyson lost his boxing license, lost his purse for the fight, and was fined an eye-watering $3 million by the Nevada State Athletic Commission. He did eventually get his license returned, and decades later, he and Holyfield have made amends. But this is still a moment that lives in infamy. This was the first disqualification in a championship fight for 50 years, a moment so controversial that it is still referenced decades later. Resto cheats. Let's be honest, nobody likes a cheater. It's annoying enough for your younger siblings help themselves to a sneaky cash bonus in Monopoly, so I think it can be agreed that the thought of losing a boxing match due to cheating is even worse. Not only are you robbed of the fair competition you signed up for, you probably got beaten up pretty badly too. That's exactly what happened at Madison Square Garden in 1983. Billy Collins was an undefeated rising star heading to a fight against Luis Resto as the favorite, most expecting him to make his record 15-0. By the end of the fight, however, Resto had claimed victory and Collins was left a brutalized mess. His entire face was horrifically swollen by the damage he'd taken. Collins' father went to congratulate the victor, and upon shaking Resto's hand, he noticed something off and immediately called for Resto's gloves to be inspected. As it turned out, not only had Resto removed an ounce of the padding in his gloves, he had soaked his hand wraps in plaster of Paris, substance that essentially hardened his wraps to the point that they were like plaster. Obviously, Resto was disqualified, but by then it was too late. He had been so vicious and so unrelenting in his beatdown of Collins that the undefeated prospect would need to retire from the sport altogether. Collins would fall into a deep depression, alcoholism, and eventually he would die at the age of just 22. Resto and his trainer were sentenced to prison, having cheated their opponent out of a fight, a career, and a life. Roy Jones Jr. is robbed. Finally, let's look back at the 1988 Olympics. Many boxers broke out into true stardom with impressive performances at the Olympics, and a then 19-year-old Roy Jones Jr. had dazzled all the way to the gold medal match with a string of excellent performances. He now found himself up against Park Si-hoon, a representative of the host nation for that year's Olympic Games. On most occasions, it's nice to see an athlete triumph on their home turf, but when Si-hoon was awarded with the gold by virtue of a 3-2 decision in favor of the South Korean, the feeling wasn't triumph, it was bafflement. Jones Jr. had clearly been the superior boxer for the entire fight, scoring 86 hits on Park and only taking 32 himself. The shambolic nature of the decision being so apparent that Park apologized to Jones Jr., knowing that he was not a deserved victor. Several journalists quoted one of the judges, Hyun Larbi, as saying he knew Jones Jr. was the deserved winner but voted in favor of Park to please the South Korean spectators. As you'd imagine, all 3 of the judges responsible for this fight were suspended, 2 of them ultimately being banned for life, whilst the rules for judging were totally rewritten to avoid this sort of scandal ever happening again. It's gone down as the worst decision in Olympic boxing, and for pretty good reason. And there it is, some of our picks for the most controversial moments in the history of professional boxing. Are there any we missed? Feel free to comment and let us know. And up until next time, make sure you keep Mike Tyson away from your ears.